I want to send out a special thanks to the sponsors of today's show, William, Josie the Mountain Troll, and Panther. Thank you so much. We humbly and truly could not do this show without you.
Southern Bramble is a Patreon-supported podcast. If you would like to support the podcast and gain access to early, unedited video footage, listener questions, or be thanked by name, you can find us at patreon.com/Southern Bramble.
You're listening to Southern Bramble, a podcast of crooked ways. I'm Marshall, the Witch of Southern Light.
And I'm Austin, Bane X Bramble on Instagram. And today we have a very special guest with us. Please welcome Ben Stimpson. Ben,
Hello.
hi, how are you?
Hello. I'm doing amazing. I have coffee in my system, so I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm getting the coffee's percolating.
Percolating. I had 2 cups this morning myself because it was either make a second cup or get up and be productive. And I said, fuck that. It's Saturday.
Let me just sit down. Let me just drink my coffee, have a moment as an excuse.
Now, Ben, please, I detect an accent, and I know
Yes.
you're not from the US. Can you tell us where you're from now? Or where you're from and where you are now?
Oh, it is a long story. So here's the Cold Notes version.
Okay.
I was born in North Wales. My
Ooh, we
parents are
love
from
Wales.
Lancashire. I know. And it's funny because where I'm from in North Wales is
Mhm.
like 20 minutes away from where Mara Starling and her group are. So it's
We
I feel
love
really
Mara.
connected.
Where
Yeah.
Mara
So
stands here.
I adore her. I adore her. I really do. I adore all the others in her coven too. But it shows how like small the world is. It really does.
Yeah.
My parents are from Manchester. We came over here in 1995 to Ontario. So where I pretty much grew up is within 2 hour range of Toronto, but like deep country, like Schitt's Creek kind of deep country, like where they filmed Schitt's Creek is actually an hour away from me. So I grew up in Ontario, Canada. So I've got about 5 accents going on at any given point, and they emerge as they need to. So right now, I think it's the British, like rural Ontario accent you're hearing.
No, I love it. I was actually going to your page on Instagram. I was listening to some of the reels because there weren't too many, but I was like, there's an accent there. But I cannot tell exactly what it is. And then I went to your website and then I saw that you are from the UK, but you also live in Canada. So I was just like, okay, we got to talk about this because
Yeah.
throughout the process of doing this podcast over the last, 3
Has it been
almost
3
4
years
years,
already?
almost
Wow.
4 years now. It's truly
Wow.
amazing. I've heard accents from all over the world, and specifically even from the UK, and almost every single
Mm,
one of them is slightly different based off of the region they're from. So I am getting to learn all these different accents, and it's really, really fun for me.
mhm.
So, Ben, can you start before we get into, because you wrote an amazing book and I want to get into that. Before we do, I want to introduce our audience, our listeners to you directly. Can you tell us about you, the work that you do? You have a podcast and a practice. Tell us about it.
So, I am an author, podcaster. I'm also a student. I'm finishing up a BA in medieval studies and classical studies. I'm a therapist in my regular life, so I'm kind of all over the place. I wear many hats. The podcast that I run is Essence Podcast with Ben Stimpson. Many of the same authors that have been on your channel have also come onto mine, and it's hour-long conversations that go a little bit deeper. And what I'm particularly interested in is the author and their work and their practice. So that's been really fun. We're coming up to about 50 episodes now. I'm starting to record my next season and having some fabulous conversations with people. In therapy, similar to Craig Spencer, who's also been on, I'm an integrative therapist, so I really blend different modalities, mostly Jungian, transpersonal, spiritual modalities into a therapy work and practice for people. And then apart from that, I'm an author. So that happened as of like the past 2 years. So my book Ancestral Whispers dropped in September, and I'm currently working on a couple of other projects. And then student-wise, folklore is really one of my major interests in my life. So I went through to complete a BA that had not been finished a few years ago, and I'm now heading towards the Masters in Folklore in the UK at some point. So actually,
Congrats.
Austin and I, oh, thank you. Austin and I both were speaking at the Salem Folklore Festival last year, and hopefully again this year. So that's where my kind of interest in folklore and magic comes in. Story is a big part of my spiritual practice, and that really comes through in the book as well, but also in my general spiritual life. I'm originally from North Wales, as I said, and the Celtic and British approach to spirituality is really through that lens of storytelling. So that's me in a small nutshell. I hope that I did a good job with that.
Great elevator pitch.
Thank you.
No, it's really lovely. First of all, I'm excited, hopefully to maybe see you at SWFF. It's a little earlier this year online because they are also doing an in-person.
In person.
So and they're splitting it up. So November 30th is the last day to put in submissions. I still haven't written mine. That's on my to-do list today. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's really exciting. Your background in classicist.
So classical. So classics would be if I'm just focusing on the texts like the Odyssey and whatnot. Classical is looking at the cultural aspect.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. Yeah, never understood that difference. So thank you for pointing that out. I just remember the first time I heard it, I'm like, did someone just call that person a classicist? Like you're a like fuck you, you classist.
You elitist classist,
Right, you
yes.
elitist classist, and then I was like, oh no, that just means you read a lot of
And speak
Classic.
ancient
Odyssey.
Greek,
You read a
yes.
lot of Homer. You read a lot of Homer.
Do you
The
know, it's
frogs.
interesting. Homer's Odyssey is one of the books that teaches us, or at least this is a running theory, and it could have been totally disproven, and we'll cut this out. If it has, and you correct me or someone else does. But Homer's Odyssey was one of the first books that helped was used as a piece of evidence that humankind didn't see the color blue until a very specific point in our evolution because of the way in which that the sea was described in Homer's Odyssey. And I have no BA or MA or DA. I have no idea what DA is, but I just made it up. And classics
Mm,
or classical literature. But I do remember learning
mm.
about that when it comes to the history of how we throughout time have marked the way in which our cones and rods in our eyes developed to interpret color. Because I believe it was described as like a wine or reddish tone in
A
the
reddish
original
wine,
script.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, so with that, so the meaty bits were there, the cones were there. We were able to see the color, but this
Meaty.
goes back to the meatiness, you know.
Hmm.
But what that tells us is that there's a correlationship between how we're perceiving things and understanding things and language. Once we have a word, which is a symbol that we can ascribe to a concept or to what we're seeing,
Hmm.
then we can start to see it, right? And so in many ancient cultures, there wasn't a word for blue. And yet, interestingly, other cultures around, like the ancient Egyptians, did have a word for blue. It's just that cultural, it's just those cultural pieces just didn't come. And I believe with the ancient Greek world, anyways, it wasn't a lack of blue not being in their landscape. It was connected to the ability to take that blue and make it into a product. So, like with any culture that had like lapis lazuli, for example, had a word for blue. It's the same actually with how any language works. So if you go up to the Arctic, they have like 28 different words for snow, but different qualities of snow because they're surrounded by it all the time. So whereas English only has a couple of words for snow because you only see it every so often. So it's a really interesting connection between symbol and kind of cognition. Really, really fascinating piece. But yes, Homer was one of the things because they were looking through it and they were like, "There's no word for blue here. What's going on?"
the use of blue and green oftentimes in many cultures, and including English, for a while, blue and green kind of get interchanged, but we see that actually with indigo, which is a very specific, I'm talking about the color, not the plant. Indigo is kind of a placeholder, but if you ask somebody what is indigo, they would point to either a blue or a violet shade, because
Mm.
indigo actually doesn't quite exist holistically. There is no spectrum of light that is so clearly indigo. Isaac Newton actually just invented it because he couldn't really tell the difference between like the demarcation between blue and violet, which is hard to see. They're very hard to see in a rainbow too. If you look at it, he actually just invented it so that he could ascribe each color to a 7 classical planet system, which if he didn't have 7, then he would only have 6, and then it wouldn't fit so holistically. So there's a little bit of completionism going on there. But I love that you pointed out the idea of the pigment, Ben. That was really yeah, of course they would only have um if they couldn't commodify it into something like a
Yeah.
pigment, then they wouldn't have that. But we also see that happens in English too. In one of my books, my working books, the Boxgrove manual, you'll see a lot of the times in early modern English, they use the term like reddish to, it's just like, oh, it's just a reddish color to describe either orange. They can be talking about pink. Of course, they could be saying rose, but they're really talking about orange, pink, maroon. They could be talking about a number of different shades, but they use the term reddish for several different planets, including the moon, Venus, I think, of course, Mars, but really they're talking about very distinct colors. We're not here to talk about color theory, but like
I'm down for it.
I love the evolution of color, especially in like a magical context, because when you look through, like, we think color is quite holistic to because color is very scientific now, but it used to be a lot more of a conceptual thing, especially where does it come from and how does color work. One theory is that it all emanates from black, another is that it all emanates from red, and we know these things to be a bit different now. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Marshall.
Oh
That,
no, of
like, I was
course,
like, woo, I
absolutely.
love that.
Well, speaking of literally our ancestors from around the world and history, you thank
Transitions.
you. You wrote a book. You wrote Ancestral
I did.
Whispers, a book about ancestor work. Can
Yes.
so first off, can you tell us personally why that's so important to you?
Of course, definitely. Well, and funnily enough, it does tie into that idea of cognition and that idea of being able to see. Because I feel like, again, so much of our experiences in life are so subjective. There's not a lot of objectivity, right? And so when I was starting to sit down and start to think about doing this work, it came at the head of a lot of personal therapy and a lot of personal growth. I was training as a psychotherapist from 2017 to 2019, just before the pandemic happened, and a big part of that process was a lot of family stuff, a lot of looking into family trauma, a lot of family history stuff. Concurrently to that, I had started running with a Lukumi Ile, an Ile of Santeria, up in Ontario here, and I actually moved in with my godfather because he lived closer to the school where I was I was studying at, and he was like, well, I've got a spare bedroom, why not? So I moved in, and so I lived with him and his partner and his orishas, and a big part of being an aleo or an Aberisha at the very bottom level there is ancestral work. So I was not only studying psychotherapy and doing this big project around family history and family work, I was also on a spiritual level doing a huge amount of work with ancestors. And that time in my life was a really big part of my own healing, because I didn't realize how much moving from the UK at age 8 really fucked me up, really like really messed me up. I was dealing with a huge amount of culture shock. I was physically taken away from my ancestors. Like there are no ancestors buried in the landscape over here. I mean, there are actually, I lie, there are a couple, because we found out that a whole branch of my family, like 7 generations ago, came over to Canada and emigrated. So I have a lot of distant relations here, but they're not my direct biological ancestors. Throughout my life, I've really connected in with Britain and British culture, and really connecting in. That's one of the reasons I started in paganism in the first place, and magic in the first place, was I was trying to get a sense of home, right? And so when I started doing this ancestral work, I realized how much of that had been a big impact for me. So when I came to the end of my psychotherapy training, I started designing a course around ancestor work, because I saw that there was a need, particularly in culture in general, but paganism particularly. Not a lot of people were talking about the ancestors. And I realized that part of that, and it's actually connected to something you two are organizing, the whole debate around how much of Christianity can come into your practice, right? I feel a lot of pagans particularly have a fraught relationship with their ancestors, because going back into however long, they're all Christians. So what do you do with these Christian ancestors in a spiritual sense if you feel like they're not going to be really like interested in working with you in that way? So I felt like there was a need to sit down and look at, okay, how can we work with the ancestors in an owned sense, in a lived traditional sense, in a lived spiritual sense, in a way that is going to not be just, taking up things that are written in the book for you. So I wrote the book as a non-prescriptive approach. It is about you developing a relationship with these individuals and with the collective, as opposed to necessarily taking up a pagan practice that is, okay, I need to do this ritual, I need to do that ritual, I need to do that ritual. And part of that process was actually allowing myself to explore that Christian heritage for myself again. Because for the longest time, I was like, no, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. But so much of that experience is part of the ancestral work. I feel like a lot of that also came into a spiritismo. Part of the Lukumi tradition I was practicing also involved a spiritismo, which involves Catholic prayers and things like that. And what that really brought me to is a place of understanding that when engaging with ancestor work, it's about the ancestors, it's not about me. And so I need to humble myself in working with the collective. Seeing myself as a part of a greater whole. So really, the book was written as a way to begin to get people to think about relationship with the ancestors on their own terms, but also as a humbling mechanism to build that relationship. I hope that made sense. I've been talking so much about this. I don't even know.
No, that was really wonderful. Thank you. The You bring up so many good points about espiritismo, and I'm yeah, thinking about some other experiences I've had recently, and it's Kardecian kind of influences that come in, and it's like, no, he was a devout Protestant, but also loved the mysticism of Catholicism clearly, and that comes in, and it's like if you've ever been to a seance or a Mesa Blanca or anything like that, it is very, we call on you, O Lord, O God, come
Yes.
into, it's
Yeah.
very that, whatever, it doesn't matter, it works. But I think you bring up a really good point about the need for integrating ancestry into also pagan practices, but I like that you've written about something that isn't a prescription of like, I'm going to give you steps X, Y, Z,
Yeah.
because I find what happens when we tend to do that as people, and also too, people want the spells, people want the answer directly. But what happens then is that it can be a little assertive to somebody else's practice, and especially somebody else's ancestral relationship, which sometimes are a lot more complicated. And by complicated, I don't mean that the ritual is complicated. Actually, I find a lot of the times that's quite simple. Place this here on this altar, or go
Yes.
here, or damn man, just change my water, please. I'm thirsty. Um,
You're not one of those types, are you?
um, but I think it can be it's more culturally derived, especially with your background in Lukumi. You'll there's a lot more formalities, a lot more
Yes.
things you should be doing, as opposed to from a living tradition, as opposed to some, I say with trepidation, some branches of paganism which are more reconstruction or
Absolutely.
invention. Uh,
Yes.
so yeah, that's all. That's all I
So,
had to say on
so this
that
is the thing. This is
before I
really
get
getting to
myself
the
in
meat of
trouble.
it. Well, so this is really getting to the meat of it, right? So and I loved my time in Lukumi. I'm not as connected with it anymore. I was really pushed into my own ancestral sphere, right? I loved my time with Lukumi, but one of the big issues with that Egun practice was all of the elements of the ritual of putting down plate, of putting the molasses in the water and offering wine and offering all of these things, right? All of those symbols were really connected to the experience of those ancestors in the tradition of the Middle Passage, right? My ancestors didn't experience that. So I had wonderful conversations with my godfather around this of how do I relate to my ancestors?
Mhm.
Because the form of the Spiritismo we practiced was like it was not even a question. Your muertos do not come into this space. It's only your spirit guides, right? Puerto Rican practice is not like Cruzado, which is, bring everybody onto your boveda, right? And there's good reasons for that. So where are my British ancestors going to be on that? Like I got this sense always that they were politely in the back of the room and they were watching these. How do I make this meaningful for me, while also not disrespecting the ancestors of the middle practice of Lukumi, right? And so that really got me to think about, okay, how am I going to connect with my individual ancestors? How am I even identifying who these ancestors are? Because the ancestors of the Middle Passage, while I was engaging with that tradition, are my ancestors too, right? But how am I going to connect with my biological blood relatives in a way that is going to be relationship feeding, right? And so I feel like this is the thing with the cultural piece, and one of the biggest criticisms in my book, I won't lie, is that I don't give people a starting point. I don't give people a foundational ritual, because if I do that, then I'm already taking away that agency from them. There are all sorts of wonderful books out there on very particular cultural traditions of how to engage with ancestors within those cultural traditions, and that's really where the cultural tradition comes in. The cultural tradition is the relationship in motion of ancestors who also engaged with those same rituals. The ritual becomes the nexus point between the living and the dead in those spaces, right? So, of course, this is why I think a lot of pagans who are reconstructionists in nature have a hard time, because they don't have those rituals anymore. And then those rituals predate all of their millions of Christian ancestors in between, right? So what do we do? And this is where, for me anyways, my practice has to be syncretic in nature in order to bring in all of those threads. Now, that's just for me. I feel like it would be irresponsible if I were to have put that in the book and said, this is what you need to do.
Hmm.
So instead, I come from it from a place of build relationships in an organic way, because all of these ancestral traditions around the world that I talk about as examples have been built in an organic way. And so you as starting to build your practice now, you're reinventing the wheel in a way, but you're being inspired by all of these carts that you see all over the place, right? If that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely does. And before we actually get into who the
Yes, of
ancestors
course.
are, because there's a section I really want to get into about that, I do want to say that I was really I thought it was very, very fascinating. Uh, your book starts with analyzing the spirit of self. And I think that's something that really just doesn't it doesn't get discussed or talked about when we think about working with spirits, animism, spirit conjuration. Like we don't talk about the fact that the very first spirit we experience, we work with, we make deals and bargains with is our own. Can you share with us more about that? Because when you said there's no starting point, I actually read that and felt like that
Well, yes.
was a good starting point,
Help,
starting
I'm
with
being
recognizing.
attacked. I would say, I would even expand that and say it's starting with your worldview. That's
Mm,
the most important piece. Because, like, from an anthropological point of view, what we often see is people are coming into paganism, magic, witchcraft, whatever, oftentimes from a place of religious trauma or a place of not wanting to be connected to birth origin traditions. So what do they do? And it's a very common thing, is that they are reading about a worldview in books, literature, whatever, and taking it on, but they're not actually disassembling the worldview that they already hold, which they've
mm,
held since birth, right? So then they wonder, well, why are my rituals not working? Well, because it doesn't go against, like, it goes against your own worldview. So understanding your own worldview, actually what you actually believe, right? But also allowing things to evolve, right? If I'm reading a 101 book, and I don't want to heavily dump on 101 books, they're very useful. But
mhm.
if I'm reading a 101 book about the goddess and the god and the lord and lady, and I'm a queer person or non-binary person, that doesn't jive with me. And I'm like, well, what do I do with this, binary worldview? Well, get rid of it, because that's not your actual worldview, right? Develop your relationship with spirits from what your actual worldview is, which actually is being vulnerable and going and understanding your worldview. And worldview comes to then self, right? When working with spirits in general, you have to understand, well, how do you actually identify what those spirits actually are? If you're working with the dead, what makes them dead versus alive, right? And that's why in the first chapter I talk about all of these really interesting kind of questions and the history of how even society now has evolved that idea of what constitutes death, right? 50 years ago, there would have been children who were born that would not be alive because they weren't able to be assisted medically. Nowadays, it's just a regular thing, right? Um, what I find really interesting with that is that when you start to get people to think about their worldview and engage with their worldview, they can go in and retcon it and kind of shift that narrative of themselves. When they become aware of how embedded, for example, the idea that God is in the sky is, then they can start to become aware of, okay, well, I don't actually believe that. That's just a really subconscious level thing that I've been dealing with. So it makes sense now why I'm not relating to the earth in a very deep way. It's
No
because
Sky
deep,
Daddy?
because there's no sky daddy, right?
Uh,
Right. You know. Do you see what I mean? So that
no.
that point, yeah. But I feel like that's a deconstructive process that people come to anyways. I feel like the more
Mhm.
you engage with new things, the more you engage with old things. I feel like this is why so many people are really interested in going and incorporating things specifically around Christianity, or we're seeing this in the Islamic community now. A lot of Islamic witches who come from an Islamic background are really bringing in those pieces as well, because it's a very complex thing, but it fits with their worldview. And so if it doesn't actually go against your own actual worldview, then what is the problem with keeping it? Well, it's that religious trauma, right? So once you understand that distinction, then you can embrace, and
You
that's a
bring
bit of a
up
tangent, but
No, you bring up such a good point, because I know Marshall and I have talked about it before, is an assertion of worldview, an assertion of cosmology, which are two different things, but they overlap with each other. Um, how do those things, because they will ultimately formulate your witchcraft for you. And this is where it gets very personal because people have different correlations and takes on it. It even gets personal for people who are within organized religions within Christianity. It probably doesn't deviate as much as you would see with people who don't have that, or are only pulling from certain frameworks to kind of mash up everything else. But it's like if you ask a relatively secular person who does believe in the Christian faith or whatever, especially in America, as secular as it is, you might be able to ask this person, well, point to God, and most of the time they would point to the sky, and yet then you would start inspecting, okay, but then God is in everything, right? And then that will just lead you down a rabbit hole, and it really points to where the person's worldview is and what their worldview is and what they're walking away out of a sermon or out of their religious background or what they're
Very
reading
much
out
so.
of biblical text or what they're hearing or seeing. It comes from everywhere, right? You're a porous vessel.
Yeah.
Um, but it will show you where their formulation of that lies. So I think it's awesome that you bring this up because before we can even get into working with our ancestors, before you can really, I think, even get into the very theoretical and potentially also starting to jailbreak your own magic and your own witchcraft,
Absolutely.
it's like, okay, where's your, aside from just like, doing a spell, which is totally fine if that's all you want to do, but
Totally.
like, where does your worldview lie?
Mhm.
And then how does that push you to either jailbreak that or be better or do better, or what's going on there? So yeah.
Well, it's blue, right? It's
Right,
blue.
it's blue.
It's blue. Because if you're looking at the world through the kind of the symbols and the words that you're used to using, then you're going to be seeing something, but you're going to be describing it a certain way. And that will impact then your ability to see its relationship with other things, right? Same with blue, right? So
Yes.
it's an interesting, it really shows how constructed the lenses that we see the universe around us with. And when we start to empower ourselves, and I think this is where witchcraft really comes into it, because witchcraft is all about empowerment. It is about taking down those lenses. I feel like this is why so many queer people, particularly, or LGBT people in particular, are attracted to these traditions, because we already have those experiences of being within those middle spaces, being outside those spaces. And so we have a unique ability to look at the world in a different way.
Mhm.
But it's also, as humans, we also we trap ourselves. We human beings are innately illogical beings. Now, I know that sounds weird considering the state of politics right now, but when you actually listen to people who are wherever they are on the political spectrum, they're approaching things logically. It's just the information that is what they're using to make those deductions, right? So I feel like with that idea of worldview, when we actually are able to empower ourselves by understanding our worldview, then we're able to make better logical choices, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The idea that it's slightly reductive, but I think this for example's sake, like if you always think that people are bad, the world is dead, uh everything is transactional, then like you are going to walk into your relationships, but not just your relationships, your entire relationship with the world, i.e. your worldview, as everybody's out to get me, everything is transactional, I need to be guarded, blah blah blah. If you are somebody who is more maybe not everybody is so awful, uh maybe there are miracles do happen, etc etc, then therefore you will walk into the world understanding that there is a chance for miracle, that not everybody is out to get you. I mean, it's reflectional, it's you get out what you put into it.
It's
So
very optimistic or pessimistic, honestly.
Mhm.
in that
Viewpoint.
example, yeah, in that
Mhm.
example, it's yeah, very
I had
one of what you're doing there.
a really interesting conversation with someone recently where I had mentioned something about the concept of the folkloric devil or the witch's devil, sometimes carrying the identity of a trickster spirit. And someone messaged me and said, like, but why would I want to work with someone who's trying to trick me? And I said, I think that that is a great question, but it's coming from
Mm,
the lens that the word trickster means someone trying to trick you. That's
mm,
not always the way in which it's applied, especially when it comes to spirits, gods, folklore. Uh,
mm,
Trickster sometimes means someone who is not trying to lie, but actually trying to get at that cunning nature, who's trying to test you, who has a game they want to
mm.
play. Now, the way that this gets presented from story to story can look rather different, but we've seen tricksters from animal spirits, foxes, coyotes. We've seen tricksters
Yeah.
in Greek gods, Venus, Cupid, Loki. We've seen
Mm,
tricksters in a lot of that, which is a Norse god, obviously, but we've seen tricksters throughout all of folklore, and a lot of it does not come down to I am trying to be your adversary, which is where
mhm.
things get misconstrued, I think. And one of the
Yeah.
things that they said back to me was, don't you think it's hubris to think that mortals can outsmart an ancient spirit? And I was
Mm,
like, okay, so again, I think that that's definitely a viewpoint that you're approaching this word with. And I don't think it's quite that simple. I think that when we work with these cunning spirits, when I'm conjuring the witch's devil, when I'm working with this identity, the spirit of my land. It is not just a trickster. It is all of these things. It is a liminal
mm,
spirit. It's the genius loci.
yeah.
It's the one who is trying to push me into some of my discomfort
Mm,
zones so I can expand and grow. It's up to
yeah.
me on whether or not I am going to be smart, clever, and cunning enough to not only survive it, but thrive through it. I think when it comes to viewpoint, again, I had a conversation recently where I was talking to someone about my wheel of the year, and I was like, listen, I live in Texas. My wheel of the year is based off of my immediate culture, the same
Yes.
way that every single one of these celebrations that did not all go together in history were part of people's cultures' experiences. This was a
Yes.
harvest festival because this festival was kind of accumulated around a time period that you were harvesting grain or meat
Mm,
or when things were barren or when spring was
yeah.
coming and the first flowers were blooming. We're now kind of amalgamating an idea from a whole separate culture of a different part of the world and trying to superimpose it onto a belief system. And if that's what you want to do, that is totally your viewpoint.
Totally
But
fine. Mhm.
yeah, but
But
mine is cultural. So that
yeah.
means where I live, the celebrations that I do are
Mhm.
about the life experiences of the literal spokes that turn my wheel of the year. That's Fourth of
Mm,
July pool party. That's Halloween, not Samhain. That is Thanksgiving. That's Christmas. That's
yeah.
New Year's Eve. Fuck, that's Valentine's Day
Right.
sometimes. You know, these are the things that are our actual living culture because holidays, Sabbats, festivals,
Hmm.
they are living. They're not just historic. And a lot of times we as cultures outgrow certain festivals because we evolve as cultures. And I think a lot of times the way in which we come towards paganism is from such a historical viewpoint, we forget how sometimes those things are not always congruent with our current reality. And I think that we should evolve with our modern times and apply
Mm,
those things instead of applying ancient ideas to modern paganism. We should apply
yes.
modern ideas to modern paganism with reverence to historical paganism.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I think that this is where the difficulty with ancestor veneration comes in
Yeah.
with a lot of people in our community because we often relegate the dead and the ancestors to the past. We don't see them as spirits that are still continuing and are present here now. And that's another huge piece about the book is that I'm really striving for people to relate to the spirits now as
Hmm.
opposed to how they were, because who they were and our idea of who they were is just like taking up a story that we've been given or taking up a celebration that we've been given and relating to them through it. And it might not be relevant. This is where the whole question about what do you do with problematic ancestors comes in.
Hmm.
My experience with Espiritismo has told me that there are mechanisms on the other side where the unhealthy are helped, right? This is why we give light to the ancestors, right? We give light to our spirits to help elevate them. Now, that's one cultural point of view,
Hmm.
but it's about still about engaging with them now, not engaging with them 200 years ago when they lived and
Hmm.
who they were back 200 years ago. It's about engaging with them now. And I think that, like you raised a wonderful point about that lived practice. You're living your practice now. So if you're holy holiday is the 4th of July or Valentine's Day or Black Friday, right? It's one of those things of, well, you're living in this now.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it holy, but festive, absolutely.
Well, if you think about it, so again, this comes back to worldview. So what
Hey, you know,
is
that's very true.
Black, well, what is Black Friday all about? Shopping.
Mhm.
Right? Now, as a Hermes kid, I follow Hermes. Shopping is one of his big things because it's a day of transaction. So for me, if I were to look at it, if I were to take what you said and
Mm.
apply my religious relationship with Hermes, I would say that any big sales holiday is a holy holiday if I see it that way. You know?
There's that worldview.
Yes, right? Yeah.
So I'm curious because gets more into like who the ancestors are. In your book,
Yeah.
you discuss who the ancestors are, and it's more than just a simple family tree. Can you expand more on that subject for our listeners?
Absolutely. So and this really comes down to my own kind of editing out of a worldview and understanding my worldview. This was a conversation I had with my godfather. I know that it's a conversation that in Lukumi and many of the ATRs, this conversation is taking place. Who and what constitutes an ancestor versus another type of spirit, right? Um, and I feel again it comes down to how we're kind of demarcating all of these individuals and these vast beings. For me, I began to realize that ancestor really was anyone or anything that has impacted who I am, as
Mm.
opposed to necessarily just that one blood relationship. So for me, when I was, 14 and reading a folklore book from the UK, and I'm over here in Canada and being miserable and not connected with Canada at all, I'm relating to the landscape. This is where the eventual folkloric practice comes in. I'm relating to the landscape and the spirits of that landscape, and they're impacting who I am in that moment. They're not just my biological relatives, they are my affinity relatives, they are my conceptual ancestors, you know. And I'll be honest, I'll go a little vulnerable. I don't is this just audio? We're not people won't see the visual, right?
The
Yeah.
general public will not, but the
Okay.
Patreon will.
The Patreon will. Okay, so
Yes, it's
for
just a
the people on
small, small
Patreon,
view.
for the people on Patreon, they're seeing that I have a British accent, I have a scar on my forehead, and I have round glasses. Now, who does that remind you of, right? Right. So
Oh
when
yeah.
I'm 37, so Harry Potter was just coming out around the time I was his age. Like I'm almost his
Oh
age
God, so
in,
you were like a teenager. Oh wow.
We're about the same age, so it was the same for me.
yeah,
Young
Harry
teen when the
Potter.
first ones came out, first books.
Yeah. And I was taunted by that. And yet there was something in his story that really captivated me, right? I mean, I didn't live in a cupboard. I'm not going to admit to that, but I still felt like I wasn't part of the world that I was supposed to be part of.
Hmm.
I was isolated. I was, bullied, all of these things. And when I discovered magic, it was almost like getting my letter to Hogwarts, right? And so I took a being bullied because I looked like Harry Potter, and he became a companion on my journey, which is, it becomes complicated when we realize how turfy J.K. Rowling became. But that's still a relationship for me. So for me, Harry Potter is ancestral to who I eventually became. This stunning academic, like wand bearing individual with glasses, right?
Absolutely. And there's a
You
huge
know.
difference between separating a childhood experience that influenced us and the
Mhm.
ultimate author. Celebrating an experience
Yes.
that influenced you does not put money in the pockets of someone who I have
No.
a whole thing on separating the work of an author from an art, which
Yeah.
usually isn't something that can be done till they're dead. But
Yes.
when it comes to the way in which a lot of these things had impact on us through childhood, the way in which it
Mhm.
got me to read, the way in which
Yeah.
I expanded my vocabulary, the way in which I felt like, wow, this character makes me feel like I'm being seen. Like I would love to have this
Yeah.
experience. So I absolutely can
Absolutely.
see that. I have had multiple characters in I love that you brought this up because I've had multiple characters in my childhood and in adulthood who have influenced me, inspired me. I never really considered them as part of an ancestor practice or an
Mhm.
ancestor, but I absolutely keep them as a spirit, as an animistic spirit close to my heart.
Very much so.
One of them is Moira Rose. Just so we're clear right off of that.
I
Moira
can see
Rose.
that. I can totally
Yes.
see that.
Well, I also, it's funny enough you mentioned the childhood one because Fairuza Balk in
Mm,
1986 did the first movie of The Worst Witch. And I just, again, as an outcast, as someone who was different and interested in magic, it was something that really spoke to me. So I've never considered a fictionalized being as someone that influenced me, as someone that I can celebrate in such a way. That's really interesting.
because the Western worldview is, and this goes back, and I talk about that in the book, the history of how we see ancestry is
Hmm.
usually through legal terms, right? If you go back to ancient Rome, they had gods and deities, and they had like Julius Caesar was an ancestor to Augustus, even though he was his nephew. All of these things, family was very different. The sense of
Yeah.
family was very different, right? And so those founding myths of those places were not just stories that they were telling themselves, they were believed fact. And in a way, in a paracosm way, they were real, right? Because the relationship between that individual, right? I'm not saying deities are fictional. I don't ascribe to that myself. But in a story sense, right? In a classical point of view, in a story sense, the relationship between that place and those people and those figures were real. And in that case, then, why can't we look at fictional characters in that way? Now, this comes down to worldview. How do you relate and work with spirits or figures from fiction versus, the actual spiritual world? But then that poses a question, well, what's the difference between those two? Both are different realities, but both are realities, right? So I like it's starting to verge on chaos magic and egregores and all of that. I'm not going to go into that now, but if we look at it in those ways, then why not? But then the cultural point of view comes in. Well, because blah blah blah, right? So that's where the nuance and taking ownership comes in.
Well,
It
there's
reminds
yeah.
me, it reminds me of a couple of different things, but like obviously there's this idea of in many cultures, in many um traditional practices or traditions itself, the idea of sainthood. So the elevation or diabolization of somebody, because there's that aspect of it too, into becoming a saint. Um, to a degree, does it work when you pray to it? It reminds me of something that a friend of mine, Jesse Hathaway Diaz, always says
Mhm.
in Mexico. Um, if it works and it is good, or like if it works, it's a saint. And if it
Yeah.
doesn't work, it's something else. And so that
Yes.
kind of that particular cultural aspect of like there's why there are so many folk saints, and not just in Mexico, but
Absolutely.
also in
Hmm.
other places as well.
Everywhere.
um you have something that has done work for you, um that does work, that helps, that gets what you need done,
Very much so.
whether that's the diabolization of someone or something or not,
Yes.
um so there's that sainthooded dead that necessarily doesn't mean that it is related to in other practices and other particular traditions. Like we can observe the idea of ancestral fairies or ancestral jinn or ancestral spirits that are not even human, but walk along with us and are married to us, married to somebody in our family, um, uh, or just have been walking with a particular familial lineage, or even non-blood lineage as well. We see that in certain aspects of traditional witchcraft, is like, well, you have this familiar that is passed down um through generations of next of whoever is the new
Yeah.
matron or whomever of this tradition. So there's so many different ways to look at something.
So many ways. And
uh
I mean, speaking ancestrally here, I have to be honest. So Jesse is very good friends with my former godfather up in Canada here, and his folk necromancy group. The conversations that were happening on there are amazing. And when you look at all the different variations of even Espiritismo, right, or Curanderismo, or Brujo, right, you look at how these different folk communities, these individual smaller communities, are answering this question. And it's incredible. And I feel like, again, this comes back to Baloo, right? We are so conditioned from a kind of overarching Western viewpoint, which is rationalistic, but is very much, scientific method, blah, 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 right? To not be able to see them and recognize continuums. And I feel like you can start to have fun with this. Of course, then the real work of actually testing these things for yourself comes in, right?
Mhm.
You're working with a folk character, the relationship is there. But if your worldview is to only know how to relate to something when it's real to you, then it may fall flat when you start working with, say, the devil of a crossroads, the folkloric devil, or the witch mother, or say, if we go to Venezuela, right, the court of the Vikings, right? All of these things. But I feel like that's when you start to take the leap to take ownership. And when you take ownership of your practice, that's when it becomes real.
It kind of reminds me of that quote from Miranda Priestley. It's not blue, it's not lapis, it's cerulean.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things again where until you can understand your worldview about the spectrum of blue, you won't have each individual name and be able to get the flavor
Exactly.
and texture and
Yeah.
likeness of each. It's kind of funny when you mentioned before about talking about saying like it's not that I'm saying not the gods aren't real, but the story of, and I'm thinking like, well, it's the mythology. We have Christian
Yeah.
mythology, we have Greek
Mhm.
mythology, we have Norse mythology. And now I'm
Yeah.
not saying folklore and mythology are exactly the same, but I do
Mhm.
think when it comes to this concept, we have the story
Yes.
that informs why this herb carries this virtue, the story that gives empowerment to this saint, to this god or spirit. In
Mhm.
Shinto, if something that exists for over, I think, 100 years, all of a sudden becomes a spirit. So,
Yokai.
like,
Yes.
sorry, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Um, it makes my verbiages up sometimes, but it
Oh,
was,
no, 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 no. I wasn't correcting you. I was just
oh,
I
okay.
I
I
happen
don't
to really
know.
love yokai and the whole like mentality around yokai.
Yes.
So when you raised that, I was like, yes.
Well, well, I think that these things, until you understand and know about them, because that person that I spoke to before about the trickster spirit said, well, from a Christian perspective, anything that is not of God and written about in the Bible is the
Mhm.
devil, is satanic because it's adversarial. So that's anything. So
Mhm.
if you're coming at everything like the word trickster or say, other gods and goddesses or mythologies, if you're coming at it from the viewpoint that everything that's not this thing is evil, is bad, is wrong,
Mhm.
then that's totally going to change the way that you perceive all of these things. I mean, we even have a history within certain sects of Christianity where ancestor veneration itself was considered diabolical because it was taking away energy and worship away from God. Um,
Right.
so it is very interesting,
Right.
and I think this really comes down to exactly what you described as your viewpoint and how you expand it.
Well, and
So
so if I jump in on that
please,
piece, right?
please.
That is the essence of folk religion then,
Hmm.
is the overarching religion, the state religion, the overarching is brought down into the local community and is shifted depending upon the needs of that local community. And that local community then builds that understanding. This is why it's so permeable. Things come into and out of folk religion all the time.
Mm,
I think again that it comes down to that whole idea of worldview. So, to go back to the Christian example that you were giving, right? Even within that, there are degrees. And there are important questions then. I remember during the medieval ages, there was a big discussion amongst some theologians around whether the mythological beings called dogheads had souls, because they couldn't classify them as necessarily demons or if they were something else, right? The medieval people were really, really taking on the role of the ancient Romans. They needed to make lists. They wanted to classify everybody, right? And because if the dogheads had souls, it means that they were human, in which case they could be saved, in which case then they need to be missionized. But if they didn't have souls, then they didn't need to send missionaries over there, right? So it's interesting, even again, that it's logical assumptions in that Christian worldview. If you're not of God, then you're of the devil, right? That's a logical statement based on logical assumptions, based on information. But even within that, then, that's where we get the distinction between cunning folk and witches. Folkloric witches are usually of the devil, right? Because they're of the evil. But if you're a cunning folk, you're actually aligned with God because you're using all of his natural things. You're using astrology that God has created. You're using the plants that God has created, and so on and so on. So then, in that case, then magic isn't evil.
You may even have a little pocket demon, a little phylactery spirit that sits
Yes.
in your coat pocket, but that doesn't inherently make you a witch. So yeah, you bring up a good point of that.
Yeah.
The medieval which is so interesting about your work is I also have always found that the conflation between the medieval and the Renaissance or the early modern period is like no, the medievalists are actually kind of the cool ones. They're a lot less concerned with hellfire and damnation as the Protestants,
Yeah.
but then also we don't get cool witchcraft stuff until the Protestants come along and is reformed and all of that. So, the medievalists are potentially a lot less concerned with um they see the world a little bit more holistically as opposed to a Protestant that's coming up and it's like, well, everything else is demon, like what you were saying, Marshall. The idea
Yeah.
of ancestral worship kind of gets a bad rap. It's still around at this time, but like the Protestants are starting to come out with this idea that like, well, that's not grandma, that's grandma or a demon in a grandma suit.
Yeah.
um so you need to be really careful with that. Whereas, there's a lot more debate on these things prior to that. Is it ancestral veneration? It just might be just that, instead of
Well, that
demons.
difference between veneration and worship, right? Because when you're
Hmm.
venerating, the idea with veneration in the Catholic tradition, which I'll be honest, I find it to be a lot more of an organic thing, the Catholic tradition. We see this in the Catholic nations now. Folk traditions tend to survive a lot longer and flourish under Catholic than they do Protestant when you
Hmm.
really look at the world now. But that idea of venerating, well, those ancestors are really close to God and they're talking to God. So what you're actually doing is venerating them to talk to God versus, talking to a demon and, wearing the skin of your grandmother, right? But it's an interesting thing because, I often like to think the Protestant Reformation was like the creation of heroin from natural organic things. Because if you take it from a worldview perspective, if you take away any intercessor in between you and God, and you're just relating to God, then everything in between becomes meaningless. In which case, then, if you're focused on anything in between, like ancestors, saints, local spirits, right, then it's of course going to be demonic because you're not focused on God all the time, right?
Which is then
Yeah.
why possession becomes the ultimate
Mm.
fear, which is why it's so
Yeah.
easily accessible for American horror film consumers. This is a
Yes.
completely different conversation, but I've been thinking about this a lot. Is uh because of something someone near to me said is possession becomes then the final frontier of horror, because when nothing has meaning anymore, the complete um loss of self, then
Mm.
like what else is there? Like if nobody else can save you and you can't even save yourself, then something coming into you and you having no control over that is, yeah.
Well,
Anyways.
yes. Speaking of grandma in a demon suit, because you actually brought up a really good point here. When it comes to ancestor veneration, you brought up about sometimes the conflation of worship and venerate and what all that means. There are words like honor, venerate, worship. They get conflated with one another. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to participate in ancestor veneration? Is that
Yeah.
different from worship? Is that just meaning honor? What does that mean to do ancestor veneration?
This is where the question needs to be answered by the reader, because I have
Ah.
my own answers. I think we all have our own answers, right? My time with Lakumi and my time with the Spiritismo, my time with just like the other practices that I've incorporated, I don't have a problem worshiping my ancestors because the ancestors are in such a continuum that eventually you get far back, even in blood relatives, that the ancestors become massive individuals, the collective, right?
The
I don't
clans.
have Of course. I actually don't have a problem worshiping my ancestors because I feel like for me, worship has a much broader perspective now, right? Um, but I can understand for people whose worldview comes down to that, oh, well, worship is only for God. Well, okay, worship is only for God, then how does venerate mean? How does honoring mean, right? But again, we're trying to take English language when it's so couched in one particular Western worldview and place it onto other traditions. You go to China, they have altars to ancestors. It's no issue. They are worshipping their like ancestral deities because those ancestral deities were the founders of their families, right? I feel like I'm preaching to the converted when it comes to you and Marshall, but I think for the listeners, again, it comes down to that idea of what is the language that you're using and how is that impacting how you're seeing all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
That's well, going back to Blue. Who knew
Blue
our
would become
early
thing.
yeah, who knew our early conversation on uh preconceived conceptions of color theory, and especially the conflation between blue and green would become such a big thing today. But
Mm.
yeah, this idea that your worldview is going to shape of course the language that you use as well. That's why I say worldview is everything, because it goes
Yes.
beyond just spirituality. It's how you live your everyday life. It's a complete embodiment of your perception of yourself in the world that you live in. And that doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily mean that your perception equates to the reality of the world. Um, but that definitely means that that's how you're going to look at it. Um, the sky could be perfectly pink in every way in my idea, and maybe if you have some strange and rare form of color blindness, maybe the sky is pink, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how everybody else sees it. um this idea of how your language is going to shape, are you venerating, are you worshiping, and also how your worldview allows those things to come through
Mhm.
um within the uh practices of especially in America, like contemporary evangelical secular Christianity, because we
Yes.
also have to remember in the West, especially in America, even our Catholicism is heavily evangelized. Even, dare I say, our
Yes.
orthodoxy is quite evangelicized, because when you go into church, that becomes you're donning on the sacred space for an hour, 2 hours, and then when you leave, you go back to our secular, capitalistic, materialistic life, right? That's not wholly the case, but oftentimes for most of the congregation members, that's how it is. Dare I say, before I get myself into trouble. But how do we approach our shrines? How do we approach our altars, our cups of
Mm.
water, our light?
Yes.
And do you not give those things? In so many places, I think Dia de los Muertos is a really good example of this. There, you sit down there, you drink with them. When you go to the cemetery, you go to the necropolis, the city of the dead. You
Mhm.
don't. I mean, you can invite them into your home as well, but like, um, you're partaking in something with them. And in some other cultures, which I can't remember specifically where I'm talking about, but there was something interesting here. I think it might be particular tradition in Asia,
Mm.
somewhere, but I could be wrong. You would never do those things in front of dead people, because it will remind them that they can't do that, and so
Yes.
therefore they will become jealous and they will torment you. So you would never smoke past a graveyard. Like, that's very taboo
Right.
to the idea of this religion, and as opposed to the practices that I'm coming from. Oh my God, no, please give us tobacco. Like,
Please,
that's all I
exactly.
want. Um,
Yes.
please give me a cigarette. Fuck. Haven't had one in a long time, and same, grandma. Um, so, but as opposed to this other worldview, it's like you would never smoke in front of these people. You would never dance in front of these people. You would
Be
never,
very careful.
um, never drink. You would never
Mhm.
eat. So you would never sing or anything like that, because
Yeah.
it would anger them. So
Well, it'll be part of the
Where's your
culture,
work?
depending on what you're talking about. A lot of times, different family structures carry those
Hmm.
different cultures, living and dead.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This is the thing, right? This is where things become really intentional when you're building a practice. Because if you come from a culture already, I mean, think about like everybody is born into a culture, and so much of it becomes subconscious. So in those cultures that you talked about, right, you would just not do those things because it would already be built into the social rules of that culture, right?
Hmm.
And we think about it now, like, we think about how Westerners treat cemeteries now.
Mhm.
Don't walk over the dead. Don't piss in the graveyard, right? Like
Hmm.
that's all of these social rules have been built up that we become aware of as we really start to ask up these questions. I feel like it again comes down to that place about intentionality.
Mhm.
And I feel like in outside of, well, I don't even want to say outside of Europe, because I feel like a lot of people's experience around the world now, in many, many places, is of multiple heritages. A friend of mine up here in Ontario, she is of Irish and Anishinaabe background. And she gave me, this is really one of the like pivotal conversations that really got me thinking about this way back in, 8 years ago. Um, she said, when it comes to alcohol, Irish culture is you share that drink around, right? It is a community creating thing. But in the Anishinaabe community, it has meant death. So she will never offer alcohol to her Anishinaabe ancestors. She's very particular and very careful about how she navigates those two, because, if she does it wrong, she's going to piss off one half of her biological ancestry, right?
Hmm.
We've been talking a lot about culture. We're talking about practices that we build based off of not necessarily just our blood lineage, but the
Mm.
people that we're around that raise us, that we experience with our chosen family, or, and most
Mm.
importantly, adopted family. Because I think
Yes.
that's one of the things that a lot of people who are adopted feel a little bit either unsure of, left out of the conversation when it
Yeah.
comes to ancestor work. And even when we were talking before about the way in which historical family lineages were not always as straight lines, we also had a huge amount of wards within families that is undiscussed, that
Mm.
I would say very clearly are a sort of fostering or adoption based. I mean, I'm going back in time and putting this modern terminology on that history, but I want to also make sure that we're speaking to our audience members who are adopted, who feel like, oh, I don't know my family history. What do I do in ancestor
Mm.
veneration?
Hmm. Absolutely. So, and I talk about that in the book. It is, I would say, next to the what do you do with problematic ancestors, that's
Oh,
the
okay.
next biggest question. That the two big questions. And I would say that that is a very Western question because of how, again, we conceptualize the family, right?
Ah,
If we
yeah.
privilege blood relationship, biological relationship, as being more real than the other forms of family relationship,
Hmm.
then that's pointing directly to worldview. If you ask people from any collectivist culture how many aunties and uncles they have, you ask somebody from Jamaica how many aunties and uncles they have, they'll say the
Every
whole
every every
parish.
friend, right? Every friend, relative. That it's because the community is the emphasis in.
It's collectivist.
I don't want to say outside of America that's not holistically true, but like especially in America, um, that is not the case, right?
Right.
We
Yeah.
my favorite.
Individualism and libertarianism.
Individualism. Yeah, this is the problem, right? And I think that that generates the problem of if somebody's adopted, and when we go into our genealogical research, chances are the majority of us will find a branch that's been adopted, right? So then, how are we actually disrespecting the relationship that that individual or those individuals had with their adopted relatives by even questioning whether or not that was a real thing, right? And I remember asking my former godfather this, like in Lukumi, what is the opinion on this? And he said, some Obas will say that it's only biological relationship, others will say that it's family relationship. So when he was doing his Mayuba, he was bringing in all sorts of other people that he had relationship with, or that people were important in the community. And again, I feel like we can answer this multiple ways. We can either say, figure it out yourself at what feels right to you, or we can say that even on in a cultural way, the more you go back in time in genealogy, right, the more you will find individuals popping up again and again and again, in which case then your story becomes the story of the whole community eventually. In which case then that adopts, even if you don't necessarily know kind of who the named individuals were and the biological individuals were, you know that you originated biologically from this certain cultural context. Eventually, the history of that cultural context will be your history.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll know your ancestors, even if you don't know their names. But I think this also gets to another problem. And again, it goes back to the way that ancestors are defined through legal terms is the need to know names. We need to know who these people were, right? And if we don't have their name, then they're not real to us.
Mhm. This
But they are real.
this
Sorry, go on.
reminds me so much of no, you're fine. Via Hedera, who's a lovely author who wrote their book, and they speak about, I think it's called folkloric witchcraft in the American
Multicultural experience.
multicultural. Yeah, I was like the word
It's a
multicultural.
wonderful, wonderful book. I'd recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, they write so beautiful. Uh, they write so beautifully, and on something that I don't think has really come up in conversation much within the witchcraft space. So it's very exciting that they're writing about it, is that they were adopted and they have this multicultural background of place of origin of and dealing with that and the complications surrounding that and the multicultural American experience of that, which I find so beautiful and so interesting, and why America and which doesn't mean that we don't grapple with the horrors of that, but the byproduct of it is something um uh that forces us to look at our relationship with everybody else around us, I think. And I think Via Hedera has spoken on that, this multicultural experience, and the way that that also shows up for them magically. And I think that's something that we can also do too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely think so. I definitely think so, because I feel like these questions come from systemic cultural issues. Again, going back to worldview, and once we start to unravel those worldviews, we actually see how much power we actually have. And I feel like BIPOC people and individuals who are coming from those middle spaces, right? Whether they find themselves between cultures, like myself, or whether they find themselves in a place where they don't have a direct cultural answer, they have to find those answers for themselves and develop that understanding for themselves. I feel like we find power in that. I feel like we find power in that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And because you brought this up, and I think this is a great time to ask this question. There's a section in your book that talks about relating to your ancestors from a systemic lens. That
Mm.
opens up a lot of tough conversations for people when it comes to historic and systemic prejudice,
Yes.
racism, and hard truths. Can you
Mm.
tell us a little bit more about the importance of doing this work when it relates to that?
Absolutely. So I actually grappled with this one myself, mainly because my biological ancestors, as a first generation immigrant to Canada, my
Mhm.
biological ancestors were all in the UK, right? Now, even within the UK, there are issues with that because my ancestors are from all four countries of that archipelago. There is a history there of colonialism that you wouldn't necessarily see just because I'm white, right? The reason I exist biologically is because of that history of oppression from English and Welsh and Scottish and Irish, all of those pieces, right? So I grappled with this one myself because I felt like the question, and particularly in North America, what we're seeing and have been seeing for a very long time, is that struggle of who's responsible for what's happening in the past.
Mm.
So often culturally, and we see this in the ancestral lies that families tell ourselves of, oh well, we didn't have slaves because well, we didn't, right? Or, oh, no, I'm part Cherokee, so it's okay.
Not the
Or,
Cherokee princessing. Why
yes,
is that such a prevalent thing? Oh my God.
because it's a way for families to feel okay with uncomfortable truths,
mhm,
right? This is the
absolutely.
thing.
There's a really high incidence of a lot of people now doing ancestry DNA kits, and they're finding out that for multiple generations, we're being told, oh, yes, we are part of our lineage comes from, and they'll say a very specific native
Mhm.
tribe. And we'll find out, no,
Yes.
that was not true. That was absolutely a lie, because for
Yeah.
a period of time, there were times in which, for assimilation, certain names and identities were dropped. And then there were times where you would receive benefits if you ended up having an ancestry that included this lineage,
Mhm.
depending on
Yeah.
what was going on within the government at the time, statewide at the time, location at the time. And there were times when there was no way to check these things. And people would make proclamations about family histories, and then they would pass that down for
Yes.
generations. And we're only now finding out grandma lied. Okay.
A l- sometimes as well, an uncomfy side of that as well is like a lot of the times it's used as a cover up
Oh, yeah.
for uh
Essay.
yeah, sexual assault, genocide,
Mhm.
just direct like slave ownership or misplacement of indigenous people.
Yes.
Hmm.
A lot of the times that's also what it is a cover up for, and we see that also in folklore too. A well-known folklore piece of folklore from my area, which a lot of people don't talk about, is actually a cover up for um uh something tragic that happened. But
Absolutely.
uh, so yeah, that also comes up too. You make
Mhm.
a really good point of that, Ben. And how do we grapple with that? And how do we, because I think that's the thing that ancestral veneration brings up. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's fixed. It doesn't mean that it's
Mm.
healed, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be pleasant.
Mhm.
But I think that with these things, that is what the whole, potentially the whole point. And there could be many points, but one point I think is how do we not fix, because that's not going to do it, or we can't change it, it's already happened, but how do we take the information that we have from the past, apply that to a spiritual practice, and also doing the real work, I'm not saying that the spiritual side isn't the real work, but the material work, um, and how do we then go from out of our shrines, out of our altars, out of our homes, or wherever
Mhm.
you're doing your spiritual work, and actually implement that into the world around you to make the world hopefully a better place, or at least make the immediate community you live in a better place, so that it
Yes.
can impact the world around you on a
So
holistic
this is where I'm going to get really harsh and tough and go and really bully people here. So this is where
where
leftist people need to shut the fuck up. So this is the issue, and maybe I'll get myself in trouble here. This is the issue with the politics of North America in general. You've got
Mhm,
right-wing people, conservative people who don't even want to acknowledge it. You've got left-wing people who also don't want to acknowledge it, but in a different way. What do? They pass the buck right back to those ancestors, right?
mm,
Well, they were problematic people, so I don't want to have those in our ancestral line. I'm canceling them, right? So
mhm.
what does that do? That actually shifts the responsibility of what's happening now on the ground, of how we are perpetuating those systemic issues to those problematic ancestors, and they're
Right.
becoming scapegoats.
You're giving
Now,
the problems to the ghost.
exactly. And so what are we doing? We're relegating those individuals, those ancestors, to who they were in the past, instead of bringing them to the now and asking for their assistance to undo the things that they perpetuated. Because when we die, we'll be part of that perpetuation. So for me, there's a difference between celebrating and condoning behavior and uplifting the individual, right? This is really where the spiritismo comes in, right? I want the healed individual who was that ancestor, 150 years ago during those periods. those ancestors 60 years ago, those ancestors 30 years ago, those ancestors 10 years ago. And I am not going to say they were problematic and that's it. Right? I'm going to ask them for their assistance because they now have a broader view of the impact of what they were perpetuating to bring me and help me to have insight into then how is that sitting on the ground now and how am I perpetuating it, even in a subconscious way. And how does that work? Well, I need to tell the truth. I need to uncover the truth. I need to be really relishing in that truth and understanding that truth, but also then not saying, well, I wasn't responsible for that. Well, no, you're not responsible for what they did, but you're responsible for what they handed you. And I think this is where both sides of the political spectrum get it wrong, right? And I have seen far too many people ask this question of what do you do with problematic ancestors, go the direction of, well, I'm just going to cancel them. Because then that's a compartmentalization. And then it's, okay, I don't need to deal with that uncomfortable truth, you know? This is where the whole lie of the Indian princess or the African prince or the, you know, all of these things come in. I had a really amazing, oh, no, he wasn't on my podcast. I was on his podcast. He actually had an ancestor who was on the Mayflower, and he was a good Puritan stock. And in his family, I know, good Puritan stock. In his family story, the idea was that they were so godly that they weren't involved with slavery. Well, it turns out that they did have slaves. So for him, then, as a modern gay individual in like sitting with that now, then it caused him to ask a lot of interesting questions for himself. Well, what was that family trying to do by telling that story? If he had just said, well, that story was a lie, and then I'm not trusting my family stories now, that's doing the simple answer. He said what he needed to do was actually go into the family and see what was trying to be protected. And once he uncovered what was trying to be protected, he was able to separate that one thing from the rest of the family, right? It's that not condoning behavior versus making somebody a scapegoat, right? Yeah.
Well,
Blaming it
that
on the ghost and washing your hands of it.
yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that goes deep into the history of or just the straight up statement of you have to understand your history, otherwise you're going to be doomed to repeat it.
Exactly.
If we don't understand, listen, I am a cis white man in the United States. Like I know the direction out that my family tree goes in. And
Yeah.
some of it goes in different areas and some of it goes in other areas. But
Yeah.
that is the reality of what it means, at least for me as a white man with family history in this country. That's what it means. It's something that we
Yes.
all need to take ownership of and recognize and see how it affects us. I
Totally.
myself have made the statement literally, as you said earlier, I have made them a statement like, hey, if you don't want to include a veneration in your practice, that doesn't make you any less valid of a practitioner. While that is true, I don't think I would necessarily remake that statement today after having this conversation because this
Mm.
really opens up my eyes to some of the things that I have not considered before. I saw someone make a statement saying that believing you do not need to partake in an ancestor work comes from the concept of white supremacy. And I at first read this and I immediately wanted to mentally push back. And honestly, when it comes down to it, if your mind immediately wants to push back, you should stop and take a second. Maybe it's just for me. I should stop and take a second, ask myself
Mm.
why. We should be
Yeah.
asking ourselves why almost a million times a day with almost every decision we make. But this one
Mhm.
specifically made me stop and think, hold on, why did I have such a reaction to this? And why did I feel the need to get defensive about it right away? I mean, it's quite clear because I haven't done some of this work. I've done
Mm.
some of it, but I haven't done all of it. There's much more work that I
Yeah.
can do here. I think a lot of us, no matter who we are, no matter what culture we come from,
Mhm.
have so much benefit when it comes to doing ancestor work.
Absolutely.
Really breaking down a lot of our histories. One of the things that came up earlier, we were talking about learning about our family's background and finding it's not quite as simple as we were told. I remember when I was much younger, I was told that My granddad's father came over here from Poland. He was a Jewish immigrant in the early 1900s, came from Poland and came through Ellis Island. They said his name was too foreign, too Jewish, and changed it, dropped
Mm,
off half of the entire.
of
I'm not
course.
going to say the last name on air, but dropped off half the entire last name. So that started a whole new lineage here in the United States.
Yeah.
And I only later found out that was not the case. It was him that dropped it so he
Yeah.
could assimilate more in the United States.
Yes.
So
Very common, right?
it completely changes the narrative of the way that I believed he crossed and started. It was a choice. It was not something that was thrust upon them. And to some people, that may seem small, but to me, that changes the way that I see our family lineage. It's the way that I conceptualize it. This was a choice to assimilate, and it's up to me to decide how I want to process that information. Because from the other direction, and again, this might seem small to some people, but there was a sort of when it's thrust upon you and you have no choice, there's a bit of
Mm,
victim mentality going on there. But when it is my choice, when it was my ancestors' choice to make that, that changes the color a little bit more. And that changes the motivation behind it more. And that changes the
yes.
way that I internalize it now.
Very much so. Very much so, right? And I think I just need to say this because I didn't say it before and I don't want people to get the wrong impression.
Mhm.
If you find that there is a particular ancestor that you makes you really deeply uncomfortable or even just uncomfortable, you don't have to work with that ancestor. And I think that's another part of ancestor work that makes people uncomfortable, is
Yeah.
that oftentimes it's couched as, well, you have to work with them all, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is what you were saying is that go into yourself and figure out, okay, what is uncomfortable about this person to me? What is uncomfortable about the story about this person to me? Because this is the other thing too. Just as families are able to create all sorts of stories to support kind of the uh, to support the family from the the negative truth or the uncomfortable truth, so too can stories be created as ostracization. Right? How many black
Mm.
sheep of the family that were actually erecting very strong and healthy boundaries have been told within the family were, perverts, this, that, and all. How many LGBT people
Hmm.
have been said, well, we don't talk about him. We
Look
don't
at
talk about him.
Encanto.
Exactly. Right. In which case, then we're growing up in a family where that's the story about that individual that we're told. That might not be true.
We don't talk about Bruno.
Yeah, we don't talk about Bruno. You know.
And we do this thing too, not just to our individual families and lives, but we also do this, especially in America, to places. Going back to the folklore that I was saying is a cover up of probably a lynching, I believe. The Hog Island Witch, which is a place close to me, is a
Mm,
folk tale about a witch or a specter that haunts these particular woods, and there's a campsite out there, and blah blah blah. Another good example is a lot of the times you'll see um now I'm on this kick because I was just at a cemetery yesterday and I have one like this close to me, is integrated cemeteries that are older. You'll see this a lot, particularly in the South, where it will say, oh, this is a black, white and native cemetery, and they love perpetuating this. Well, the one that is in my area is like, well, it's native because you buried on top of a burial mound to
right.
show the supremacy of your own dead. Even is that you've
Yes.
created a plot of land on top of a burial, a Native American burial mound. And it's a historic cemetery, so I don't even know. It's the legal complications of the Seminole
Mm,
people that already gets encroached on all the time. Blah blah blah. It's very complicated. Um, and then of course, the integrated part where a desegregated cemetery is always a
right.
very uh well, when did that
Mm,
become a thing? And also, even if it is going back, it's like, well, slaves are still considered property until
right.
a certain point in American history. So it's yeah, it's very complicated. The
It
beloved
is.
beloved servant, um uh stories that come up, like what we were talking about in families, are also
Yeah,
absolutely prevalent. And it's like, well, it's still slavery at the end of the day. And this is
right.
obviously a very uh I'm speaking, on personal experience and the experiences of friends and things around me. Your ancestral lineage might look different, um, and it have its own complications. But I think that's the point that Ben is trying to get at, is that it doesn't absolve you from inspecting it, taking that and working with, okay, how do I apply this to my everyday life, my inner world,
Yeah,
and also the external world around me, and how do I
totally.
deal with that within my own landscape?
Yeah, exactly. Because and it all comes back to spirit, right? If we relegate because we're uncomfortable or we find a particular strand of ancestry problematic and we cancel them, then we are, without even getting to know them first, we may actually be taking away an ally who can use their spiritual intercessory powers, if that's your worldview, to effect positive change now, right? Because we're limited to that, right? And then that tells us more about where we're and our discomfort than it does about necessarily where they're at now, because we're relating. It's that whole, I'm going to be a bully again. I apologize. I feel like a lot of folkloric
I love it.
witches, though, are very anti this to begin with. So I feel comfortable saying this, but it's the whole myth of the, we're the
Yeah,
grandchildren of the witches that you didn't get, right? Bullshit.
we're the granddaughters of the cringe you couldn't cringe.
It's
Absolutely.
bullshit.
Uncringe.
It's bullshit because
Yeah.
what is it doing? All that is doing is making you feel comfortable with your unlooked at religious trauma, right?
Not
That
even
is a
really
narrative
comfortable.
myth.
Not only just comfortable, but superior because you are the
Exactly.
survivor. You're the
Oh,
one
you're
who
the
gets to take
survivor.
revenge.
You know?
Like
Yeah.
there is a
Like, come on, Becky, come on.
yeah. Now, it is interesting. I did recently see something about the way in which that verbiage started from a place of trying to bring about empowerment, especially to women. And then it slowly started to turn and change and evolve to become something, especially within like the community of online witchcraft. It started to take a different turn. And so, I absolutely see what you're saying. It's cringe as fuck. And every now and again, I try to remind myself that's not necessarily where it started. And hey, maybe that's some of the work that I needed to do to
Mm.
understand that history. Before we get, because we're getting kind of close to the end here, before we finish
Sorry.
out, no, that's totally okay. This has been one of the most fascinating conversations, and it's been really eye-opening. I feel like there are so many things here that I myself have feel come up somewhat pushed for. I think we need more people to push some of these boundaries. When you when you said I'm gonna bully and get harsh here, I was just like, do it. I think people need to
That's
sometimes.
my therapy style, just saying.
Yes, some people. There are ways in which we can deliver information that we need to hear, and just because you might feel bad hearing it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be said. And it's not even meant to make you feel bad. It's meant to make
No,
you listen, understand, evolve your
absolutely.
worldview. And speaking of evolving worldviews, I don't so the whole second part of your book and in part two, you get kind of it's not a how to, but it does give you some really wonderful pieces of advice and steps. And I want people to read this so they can go deeper into it. So I want to do a light summation of it. You
Totally.
create a wonderful guide for people who want to start ancestor veneration. And I really want to see before we go if you could just give us a few simple starter steps for people who want to start forming a living practice.
Absolutely. So the second half of the book is really the nitty-gritty of a lived spiritual practice, right?
Lived.
The things, all of those pieces can be applied to if you're working with deity, if you're working with land spirits, if you're working with ancestors, if you're working with self even, right? All of those pieces can be applied to working with your own spiritual self.
Mhm.
So it's things like use of space. It's using and utilizing, going back to what we were talking about, blue, right? How do you work with color? How does that come into it? Really, the whole second half of the book is how to communicate. So I see personally ritual and spiritual practice and lived spiritual practice all as forms of communication with self, with spirit, with the world around us, right? Because it's all symbolic. And I hate to say that word symbolic because oftentimes people can maybe think that symbolism is not real, but it is real because we're putting out information all the time. So if you're creating an altar space, being intentional with what's being communicated through all of these aspects and all these pieces. What is the altar space actually being used for? What is the purpose of it? How is it going to come into your work, right? What is the relationship that you're conveying or strengthening through this? A very good example is where to put your altar space to your ancestors. Are you, in a metaphysical sense, putting it close to the center of the living space, which is the kitchen, or are you going to put it towards the back door, which is symbolic of exits, death, right? When you think of what you do, ritual practice, what are you doing with ritual? Is it a form of communication? And if you're communicating, what are you communicating, right? So it's piece by piece by piece of a full-fledged lived practice, because it's not just up here. We can sit here and pontificate and talk about, you know, spiritual work from our armchairs. When we actually get up to do something, though, it's that spirituality in action. Another key piece is there around prayer. If we're actually communicating through verbiage, how are we going to do that? What are we doing? Another key piece there is pilgrimage, this idea of going to those spaces that our ancestors were connected to. First of all, that falls back in with who are we even seeing as ancestors? One of the examples I give in the book is the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is an amazing organization that is trying to rebuild ancient pilgrimage sites that were eradicated during the Protestant Reformation, and rebuilding that infrastructure so that people can go on spiritual journeys. But also spiritual pilgrimages around things like ideas. If you have a particular character, this is one of the reasons that this was unlocked for me. If you have a particular character that you have grown up with and is ancestral to you, like, for example, Harry Potter, then I can go on pilgrimage to the train station in London. I can go to the village up in Scotland. I can go to these places that are connected to that story. And in a way, it's a pilgrimage because pilgrimage is intentional. It isn't just a vacation. It's you're going with the intent to transform. So how do you do that, right? And then I've really lost track of what's in the book because I haven't looked at it in a few weeks.
I love that you
But
brought up
yes,
pilgrimages. I think it's so funny. I think a lot of us as magical practitioners in the United States will make a trip to Salem at one point. Now, I
yes,
say this, and I know that if people are only going thinking from A to B, they're going to be like, well, witches weren't actually, you know, killed in Salem. And I said,
doesn't
I'm
matter.
thinking all the way to Z here. We think of Salem as a spot where a persecution and hysteria took place. That
Mhm.
hysteria ended up actually bringing practitioners through the centuries to that place. They
Exactly.
built stores, they built a mecca, that they built statues to lift up this identity. And so nowadays, a lot of practitioners will make a pilgrimage to Salem
Hmm.
so they can experience what these ostracized and marginalized parents
Absolutely.
that people went through when they were accused at the end of the finger of being a witch. I know I personally have a long-term plan to make my way over to Germany to see Auschwitz, where I had lost family
Yeah.
in the concentration
Mm.
camps. I would like to go to Scotland because I have family that a lineage that goes to England to Scotland to Wales, and I've already been to Ireland, so I've done my pilgrimage there. But
I
it is
love
one of
it.
those things where we really dig deep down into getting to the dirt of the
Absolutely.
places that the
Absolutely.
people that influence us get back to.
Yes. Yes. And pilgrimage doesn't have to be thousands of miles away.
No.
I can't think. Oh, it's in the
Sometimes
book
it's going to
somewhere.
your childhood house that's been sold multiple times
Exactly.
just to stand in the front lawn and
Just to
look at
stand
it,
there.
take it in.
Exactly. Exactly. It was an Olarisha who came out with a book, and I can't remember I can't remember her name now, but it's in the book anyways. And part of her ancestry is from a tiny little place in Texas. She doesn't have where they're buried. She doesn't have pictures of them, but she does have a little like little trinket thing that had a picture of this town. So part of her ancestral pilgrimage was going to the spot that this little picture of this town was taken, going there and imagining her ancestors all in front of her. The ancestors that she imagined lived in that space. That was pilgrimage for her. It was intentional, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
It all
Yeah.
comes back to necromancy,
It
one
all
way or
comes back to.
another.
I had Mortellus on a few weeks ago for my own podcast, and
Hmm.
they made a really good point. They talked about, I asked them, what do you consider death work versus working with the living? And they were like, everything's death work because we're all dying
Hmm.
Every
All the
day.
time.
every day,
Not
every
I.
day.
This has been a really, really wonderful conversation, an
Oh,
eye-opening conversation. Um, I feel challenged, and I love that because that
hmm.
means that my worldview has expanded. And I really, really hope our listeners feel like their worldviews are expanded. If this feels daunting for you, just as a listener's advice from someone who's taken a lot of these experiences, I think we can always start small. I love that it starts with yourself. Start with
Yeah.
recognizing your own spirit. If you don't know anything, if you are adopted or you don't know anything about your actual ancestry, about where the actual DNA in your blood comes from, you can look at the culture that you're raised in because that absolutely influences you. The things that you remember. Just this past Thanksgiving, I had my sister's friend come over, and her best friend in high school got pregnant. Her daughter's now, I think, like 8 or 9 years old, and she calls me and my sister Uncle Marshall and Auntie
Yeah.
Amanda. We are not related, but we grew up.
You are related.
We are exactly, of course, absolutely.
Yes,
But that's what
right?
I mean.
Mm.
As far as we are all concerned, we are family, and it was one of those things where you have to understand the actual blood lineage. It's me and my sister are the only grandchildren on this side of the family. That's it. Um, it's the name is ending with us.
Mhm.
So when I take a step back and I see the family that I've created and built, it changes the way that I think about ancestry. And I think that that might
Yeah.
open up a lot of perspectives for our listeners too.
I hope so. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for having me on. This has been wonderful. I wasn't quite sure what to expect because I always feel like I'm like the dour, like, oh, miserable, miserable Ben, and you always have some fun guests on. So I'm really glad that this went the way it went. This was lovely. Thank you.
It was lovely
Absolutely.
having you.
You've been listening to Southern Bramble, a podcast of crooked ways. I'm Marshall, the Witch of Southern Light. You can find me on Threads and Instagram and TikTok at Witch of Southern Light. You can find my book, Cunning Words, A Grimoire of Tales and Magic, on Amazon.com, as well as the black and white version on uh, Barnes and Noble. If you want the color paperback version, the link for it is directly in the link tree in my bio. There is lots of other really wonderful links in my bio. They are free for you. Links to my art, links to other videos, lots of free resources. Check them out.
And I'm Austin Bain X Bramble on Instagram and basically everywhere else. You can check out all my womanly wares, including perfumes, at banexbramble.com. I do have a Venus materia collection, working on a particular election for Venus and Libra. I have a couple of talismans coming out, a glamour wash. A friend of mine gifted me a really wonderful stone um, from the Temple of Venus on the island of Crete, or Cyprus, excuse me. and it's a really wonderful stone that looks like a booby. And so that has kind of been the importance of the entire collection, as well as the Mother of Demimonde incense, which inspires all the lustful and yearning Venusian qualities. So that will be coming out this Friday as you are listening to it. So please check that out if you would like. Ben, thank you so much for being on. Where can everybody find you? And tell us where to find your book.
Of course, definitely. So my book is available through all places that you can normally find books: Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I often like to say go to your local bookstores, independent bookstores. Most of them will be able to order from Llewellyn or through the distributors. And you can find more information about me, my book, my podcast, all of my various socials at benstimpson.com. I have some classes on there. I've started putting classes up on Udemy, so they're available on demand. And my podcast, of course, is available through my YouTube page and through Spotify, all of those places. So come and check me out.
At this point in time, we would love to thank our Tier 3 supporters from our Patreon by name: Jason, Nico, Colby, Callie, Johnny, Jamesa, Jennifer, Cindy, the Witch of Patapsco Forest, John, Giles, Jennifer, Shauna, the Modern Babylon, V, Lisa, Ariella, Keith, Jens, Adity, Tracy, Timothy, Witch Rafa, the Lady Ghost, Seashaw, and of course, Key Archibald. Thank you so much for your support. I truly can't tell you what it means to us to have you be part of the making of our show.